The summer sun glared down like an interrogator's lamp, bleaching the sky to a harsh blue and turning the lake surface into a molten mirror. Dragonflies buzzed in lazy loops over the reeds, and the scent of cut grass lingered in the warm air. I had just slipped into the water, feeling the cool silk of the lake slide over my shoulders when I heard it, that voice. Shrill, commanding, and unmistakable. "Excuse me. That's not your decision to make." I turned mid-float to see her standing on the dock. "Karen." Arms folded across her floral blouse like some suburban warlord, a pair of oversized sunglasses perched on her nose, and her mouth already forming the next complaint. Behind her stood a man in a beer-stained tank top, dripping from a recent dip in the water, puffing out his chest like a frat boy at a kegger. I didn't know him, but I knew the type. Entitled. Loud. Used to getting away with things because no one wanted the headache. "Your guest needs to leave," I called back calmly, keeping my voice even despite the anger boiling under the surface. "This part of the lake is private property." "My property." Karen scoffed, loud enough for the whole shoreline to hear. "He has every right to be here. This is a shared amenity and I'm on the HOA board. You don't get to make the rules just because you live on the water." I swam to the edge and pulled myself onto the dock, water dripping from my shoulders as I faced her. "Actually, I do. This part of the lake isn't community property, it's deeded with my land. Check the plat map." But she wasn't hearing it. She didn't want to hear it. Karen didn't care about facts, she cared about control. Her guest smirked behind her, sipping from a can of cheap beer and tossing the empty into the bushes like he was marking territory. That was the final straw. "You," I pointed at him, "need to leave. Now." He laughed, slow and mocking. "Karen said I could be here. I ain't going anywhere." At that moment it was clear, this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a challenge. A power play. And Karen was staking her claim, on my land, in my space, and over my peace. I walked past them both, calmly but firmly, grabbed my phone, and dialed non-emergency dispatch. "Yes," I said. "I have a trespasser on private property refusing to leave. No weapons. Just a drunk guy who thinks HOA membership gives him squatter's rights." As soon as Karen heard the word trespasser, she exploded. "You're unbelievable," she shouted. "Calling the cops on a guest? He's my family. How dare you?" I turned, looked her square in the face and said, "Your last name isn't on my deed. Your cousin is trespassing. This is your warning." What followed was a spectacle. Karen stomped up and down the dock, flailing her arms like a malfunctioning scarecrow, her cousin yelling something about knowing his rights. A few neighbors poked their heads out from patios, watching the drama unfold like it was community theater. And then we all heard it, those three sharp notes of a distant siren, growing louder as a sheriff's cruiser rolled down the gravel path toward the lake. Karen's confidence cracked. Her guest sobered up quick. The officer stepped out, took one look at me and then at them, and asked for ID. I explained the situation, showed the officer the survey of my property on my phone, and pointed out the clear boundary markers along the shoreline. The officer nodded and walked over to Karen's guest. "You've been asked to leave private property," he said, voice even but firm. "This is a criminal trespass situation now." The guy rolled his eyes, gave a half-hearted protest, but when the cuffs clicked shut around his wrists, Karen's mouth dropped open like a busted mailbox. "This is insane," she yelled, chasing after the officer. "You're arresting him for swimming?" "No, ma'am," the officer replied, glancing back at her. "We're arresting him for refusing to leave private property after being asked. That's the law. HOA rules don't override state statutes." Karen was speechless for once. It was glorious. As the cruiser pulled away, her cousin in the back seat looking like a kid grounded for the summer, I turned back toward the lake. The sun was still out. The dragonflies were still hovering. But everything had changed. Not just for me. For the whole neighborhood. Because in that moment, Karen wasn't just an overbearing board member. She was the woman who got her own guest arrested by trying to play queen on someone else's castle. And that was only the beginning. Let me rewind and give you a sense of who's who in this mess, because trust me, the details matter. My name is Jamie Foster, 35 years old, and I'm not just some guy with a house by the lake. I'm the third generation to live on this land. My grandfather bought the property back when the road was still gravel and the lake had no name. Back then it was just a hidden patch of paradise, all cedar trees, crickets, and peace. My parents built the house I live in now, and I took it over 5 years ago after my mom passed. The lake is part of my deeded land, clearly marked, well documented, and entirely separate from the HOA's so-called shared amenities. So when I say I own the slice of water behind my house, I mean it legally and historically. Now enter Karen. Her real name is Darlene, but nobody calls her that. Not even her husband, who always looks like he's mentally somewhere else when she talks. The nickname Karen wasn't something I came up with. It just evolved. The moment she moved in 2 years ago, she was showing up at everyone's door with a clipboard and a smug smile. "Hi. I'm on the HOA," she chirped like it was a badge of honor. Except she wasn't, not at first. She ran for the board within 3 months of arriving and won. Mostly because no one else wanted the position and she campaigned like she was going for city council. Karen was the kind of person who reported mailbox colors that didn't match the approved palette, and left anonymous notes about lawn height. She once knocked on my door at 7:15 a.m. to tell me my garbage can had been visible from the road, on trash day. Her husband, Rick, trailed behind her at events like a ghost in khakis, clearly regretting every decision that led him to Lakeside Pines. The HOA board was once just a formality. The original members, mostly older couples who just wanted to maintain the roads and pay for snow removal, never bothered anyone. But Karen turned it into a kingdom. Monthly meetings became mandatory with voting sheets, email blasts, and community engagement surveys that were less about gathering opinions and more about pushing her own agenda. I usually kept my distance. I paid my dues, followed the actual rules, and stayed out of drama. But Karen had a way of pulling people into the spotlight whether they liked it or not. If you didn't respond to her emails fast enough, she'd remind you in person. If you missed a meeting, you'd find your name in the next newsletter's Community Concerns section. I wasn't intimidated, just annoyed. Like most of my neighbors, I thought ignoring her was the best strategy. That changed the day she treated my lake like it was part of her playground. You see, the thing Karen couldn't stand more than anything else was not having control. She didn't like that my property was technically outside of the HOA's jurisdiction. While I still paid into the general maintenance fund, my deed exempted me from a lot of the nonsense, like lawn inspections and mailbox regulations. My house is a few hundred feet off the main loop, with its own dock and its own lake access. It's peaceful, private, and the envy of many in the community. Karen hated that. She'd hint at it during meetings. "We should revisit lake access policies," she'd say, eyes darting toward me. "It's not really fair that some people have exclusive use." But every time she pushed, she was reminded that the bylaws didn't apply to individually deeded lakefront lots. The original developer set it up that way to honor legacy landowners like my family. And there wasn't a thing she could do to change it, short of rewriting county zoning laws, which, thankfully, was beyond even her reach. But instead of backing off, she doubled down in her own twisted way, by trying to socialize my lake. She started inviting guests, friends, family, God knows who, telling them they could use the water like everyone else. She figured if she couldn't change the rules, she could just ignore them and hope no one pushed back. Except I did. Because this wasn't just about a patch of water. It was about respect. About legacy. About not letting someone trample over what my family had protected for decades just because she had a clipboard and a fragile ego. When Karen brought her cousin to swim behind my property and dared to act like it was her right to do so, she wasn't just overstepping, she was picking a fight. And while I might be quiet, I don't back down when someone threatens what's mine. The stakes? They weren't just about lake access. They were about principle. About standing up to the petty tyrants who think HOA rules are a license to bully. About drawing a line in the sand, and making damn sure no one crossed it again. And once Karen realized I wasn't going to roll over, she launched a campaign that would test every ounce of patience I had. But what she didn't know was this: I came prepared. I knew the land, the law, and the limits of her power. And I was ready to fight. It started like most things in suburban drama do, quietly. Almost too quietly. About a week before the showdown at the lake, I noticed something strange. 2 folding lawn chairs had mysteriously appeared on the far end of my dock. Nothing fancy, just cheap, sun-faded things you'd find at a tailgate. At first, I assumed maybe one of my neighbors had wandered over, maybe to fish or take in the view. It's not unheard of. People in the community often ask to use the lake, and I've always been accommodating when they show respect and ask first. But there was no note, no text, no knock on my door. Just the chairs. Like a territorial marker. The next morning there was a cooler. And a soggy towel tossed carelessly across the end of the dock. That's when my gut started talking. By day 3 I caught them. 2 men, one shirtless, the other already halfway through a 6-pack, floating lazily on oversized inflatables just off my shoreline, laughing and blasting music from a waterproof speaker. My dock was covered in wet footprints and snack wrappers. It looked like the aftermath of a frat party, not the quiet, peaceful haven I'd spent years cultivating. I walked down to the water's edge and cleared my throat. "Hey," I called out, trying to keep my voice calm. "This is private property. I'm going to have to ask you to pack it up and move along." The guy with the sunglasses looked over at me like I was the one intruding. "Karen said it's cool," he shouted back, shrugging. "She's on the HOA, dude." That name hit me like a slap. "Karen?" "Yeah," he said. "My cousin. She said the lake's open to guests. Said this was like the community beach or whatever." I stared at him, incredulous. "First of all, this isn't a community anything. This dock and the land it's on is mine. Deeded, fenced, marked. Secondly, Karen has no authority here. And third, this is trespassing." He laughed and took a long sip from his can, tipping it toward me mockingly. "Relax, man. It's just water." That's when I snapped, not in a violent way but in a clarity of mind kind of way. The kind of snap where your blood cools and the noise around you fades and everything becomes very, very simple. I walked back to the house, printed out a copy of my property survey, and returned with it in hand. I also brought my phone just in case things got messy. "Here," I said, holding the paper out. "This line here? That's the legal boundary. You're inside it. If you don't leave right now, I'm calling the sheriff." The second guy, younger and quieter, started paddling away immediately. But Mr. Sunglasses didn't budge. "Karen's not gonna like this," he muttered, hauling himself out of the water and slapping down the dock with heavy feet. "She said people like you try to act like they own everything." "People like me?" I asked, one eyebrow raised. "Yeah," he grunted, gathering his stuff. "People who think they're better than everyone else just because they got here first." That one stung. Not because it was true but because it was so backwards. I didn't think I was better, I just thought boundaries meant something. That ownership and history deserved respect. I wasn't gatekeeping the lake out of spite, I was defending it from people who treated it like a theme park. He trudged off, grumbling. 10 minutes later, Karen showed up in full fury. She didn't knock. Just came storming down my side path like she owned the place. "How dare you threaten my family?" she screeched before I could even say hello. "You embarrassed him." "I asked him to leave my property," I replied coolly. "That's not a threat. That's a legal right." "You don't get to decide who uses the lake," she snapped. "That's up to the HOA." "No," I said, holding up the survey again. "That's up to the county. And this says otherwise." She snatched the paper from my hand, barely looked at it, and shoved it back into my chest. "This isn't over," she hissed. And I believed her. Because I knew Karen well enough to understand this wasn't about lake access anymore. It wasn't even about her cousin. It was about ego. About control. About the fact that someone had told her no, and she wasn't used to hearing that word. By the end of the week, there was a letter in my mailbox, an official notice from the HOA, accusing me of impeding access to community amenities. It was laughable, of course. The lake behind my house wasn't listed in any of the HOA's documents as a shared feature. But it didn't matter. Karen had opened a new front in her little war, and I could feel it building. Lines were being drawn. And I had a feeling this was just the opening act. Within days of our lake confrontation, the war officially began. At first, it was passive-aggressive, just Karen being Karen. I found a yellow sticky note on my mailbox that said, "Please adhere to community guidelines re, exterior furniture placement." It was written in perfect cursive and signed, and clearly referring to the Adirondack chairs I had placed years ago, mind you, at the edge of the lake. A day later, I got an email from the HOA board. Subject line, "Non-compliant structures reported on common area." It claimed my dock might be encroaching on shared lakefront space, and required a formal inspection. That's when I knew Karen had weaponized the HOA. Never mind the fact that my dock had been standing longer than most of the houses in this development. It had been permitted, recorded, and restained twice before her house was even built. Still, she managed to convince 2 other board members, newer residents who had never once walked the property lines, that the community should re-evaluate the historical use of the lake. The inspection letter included a date and time. I was expected to allow an authorized HOA official and support staff onto my property to measure my dock and assess shoreline compliance. Support staff? What was this, a military operation? When they showed up, I was ready. Clipboard in hand, Karen arrived with 2 board members I barely recognized and a guy with a tool belt who looked more confused than anyone. I greeted them at the edge of my driveway, survey documents already printed and marked. "You're not stepping 1 foot past that post," I said, pointing to the corner marker. "This is private property. The HOA has no legal right to conduct inspections here." Karen put on her best fake calm voice. We're just doing our due diligence, Jamie. This affects the whole community. You can't exclude everyone from something just because it touches your yard. It doesn't touch my yard, I replied. It's part of it. Deeded. And if you or anyone else steps beyond that post, I'll call the sheriff for trespassing. Again. She narrowed her eyes. You're being awfully aggressive for someone with nothing to hide. I didn't rise to the bait. I just smiled and held up the county zoning map with a red circle drawn neatly around my parcel. You're welcome to file a complaint with the county. I'm sure they'll enjoy sorting it out. Just be prepared for legal fees. And public records. Karen and her troop retreated, but the campaign continued. Over the next week, I received 3 HOA violation notices. Unapproved watercraft. They claimed my kayak, which sits on a wooden rack beside the dock, was an unpermitted structure that needed to be removed. Noise complaint. An anonymous report accused me of playing offensive and aggressive music by the lake. I don't even own a speaker. Unauthorized landscaping alterations. Apparently, trimming my own hedges without submitting a landscaping change form was grounds for citation. Each notice arrived in a stiff envelope with HOA letterhead. Each one signed sincerely the board. And each one was clearly Karen's attempt to push me toward submission through bureaucratic harassment. The tipping point came when a sign appeared near the lake path that led behind my property. Read. Shared access point, all HOA members welcome. It wasn't official. It didn't bear the HOA logo or approval. Just a laminated printout, zip-tied to a post, and clearly designed to confuse people into thinking my dock was a public feature. I ripped it down immediately, took pictures and sent a strongly worded email to the board. Post unauthorized signs on my property again and I'll file for a cease and desist. This is not a game. Karen responded that evening with a smug email. Hi Jamie. The sign was placed to reduce confusion for new community members who were unaware of the lake's open nature. If you're unwilling to collaborate on a solution, perhaps the board will consider formal mediation or covenant review. Best. Karen, HOA Board President. Covenant review. She actually had the gall to imply that they'd rewrite the HOA bylaws just to force access to my lake. That's when my heart rate spiked, not with fear but pure indignation. Because that kind of bureaucratic overreach isn't just annoying. It's dangerous. And emotionally, I was exhausted. I'd wake up with anxiety, wondering what new letter or sign or anonymous complaint was waiting for me. Neighbors started looking at me differently, some sympathetic, others curious, some clearly misinformed by whatever Karen was whispering during her daily dog walks. I was being painted as the grumpy lake hermit who didn't want to share. The guy who called the cops over a swim. Never mind the facts. In a war of perception, the truth moves slower than rumors. Still, I refused to back down. I wasn't just defending my rights, I was defending the principle that rules matter, and that no clipboard-wielding dictator should get to rewrite reality just because she thinks she runs the show. But I knew this wasn't over. Karen had overplayed her hand. And I had an idea forming. Something sharp. Something legal. Something she wouldn't see coming. It was a Thursday morning, quiet and overcast, when everything clicked. I was sitting on my back porch, sipping coffee, watching a heron land gracefully at the edge of my lake, when I heard Karen's shrill voice somewhere nearby. Can just walk around the fence. It's public water, trust me. I couldn't see her, but I knew the tone. It was her sales pitch voice, the one she used when she was trying to convince someone of something she almost believed herself. That's when I realized, this wasn't just about one incident anymore. It was a campaign, a calculated, manipulative effort to redefine the rules by ignoring them until people stopped resisting. And for the first time in weeks, I stopped feeling angry. I started feeling focused. I wasn't going to yell anymore. I wasn't going to fire off angry emails or threaten lawsuits. I was going to fight this the way Karen would never expect. By becoming more meticulous, more methodical, and far, far more dangerous to her reputation than she ever imagined. That afternoon I went digging. I started with the HOA bylaws, print copies, the archived versions, everything. They were dry, dense, and loaded with boilerplate, but they had one fatal flaw. They were extremely specific. Especially about jurisdiction. I highlighted every mention of shared property, community access, jurisdiction boundaries, and non-governing lots. My parcel. Crystal clear in every version. Exempt from HOA oversight regarding land use, shoreline access, and structural modifications. Then I went deeper. County property records. Aerial zoning maps. Historical development plans from the first time this land was subdivided. And sure enough, my lot, originally filed under the name Foster Parcel 1A, was legally distinguished from the newer lots built around it. There was a memo buried in an old zoning document that stated explicitly, Parcel 1A is to remain private under the existing deed. No HOA authority shall override this clause. Bingo. But I wasn't done. The real gem came when I requested minutes from HOA meetings held over the last 12 months. By law, the board is required to make them available to homeowners upon request. They didn't expect anyone to actually read them, which is why I was the first to notice something peculiar. In the April meeting, Karen had submitted a motion to review community shoreline access options with potential to increase inclusivity. Nothing crazy, just vague bureaucratic language. But in the following meeting's notes it stated, Board agrees to allow guests of HOA members temporary access to shared shoreline paths until clarified. The problem? There were no shared shoreline paths. Not officially. Not according to any map or deed. Karen had slipped it through with vague wording and no formal vote, and now she was using that footnote as her justification to tell people they could treat my lake like a public park. It was sloppy, reckless, and completely out of bounds, so I built a file. Not a rant, not a complaint, just a tight, tidy factual dossier. Maps, highlighted bylaw excerpts, zoning memos, and screen captures of the meeting minutes. All neatly indexed. Then I added a copy of the trespassing laws from our state. Statutes just for extra weight. But the piece de resistance? A letter from a local real estate attorney, my cousin, bless him, stating that if the HOA continued to encourage or tolerate unauthorized use of private land, the property owner, me, would be forced to pursue injunctive relief and damages. It was worded gently but firmly. The kind of letter that makes board members sweat. Still, I wasn't done. If Karen wanted a public game, I'd give her one. At the next HOA meeting, I showed up early, first time in months. Clipboard in hand. Calm expression. Full legal file printed and bound. As neighbors filtered in, I quietly passed out copies of my documentation to a few of the more reasonable residents. I said little. Just smiled and said, you might want to read this before the meeting starts. And then I waited. When Karen began her usual monologue, something about community unity and shared lake resources, I raised my hand. She hesitated. Jamie, this isn't. It is, I said, my voice firm but even. And I have the documents to prove it. I opened the file. Read excerpts aloud. Displayed zoning maps. Quoted the exact deed language. And when I passed around the attorney letter, there were actual gasps in the room. Karen tried to recover. Let's not turn this into a legal thing. It already is, I replied. You've encouraged people to trespass. You've violated your own board procedures. You've misled this community. The room was silent. Even Rick, her eternally bored husband, looked like he wanted to crawl under the folding table. I wasn't angry. I was composed, professional, and more dangerous in that moment than any shouting match could ever be. Because now I had the power of proof, of process. And Karen? She had nothing but her smug face and a rapidly unraveling narrative. And best of all, I wasn't even close to finished. The next 72 hours after the HOA meeting were surprisingly quiet. No emails. No fake violation notices. No mysterious signs zip-tied to the path behind my fence. For the first time in weeks, it felt like the air around my property had cleared. No more tension, no invisible eyes watching from across the street. But I knew Karen. She wasn't the type to go down without a last gasp. Sure enough, the final act came on a Sunday morning. It started with a splash, literally. I was having coffee on my patio when I heard it, a loud, obnoxious belly flop followed by laughter. I walked to the edge of my yard and to no surprise, there he was again, Karen's cousin, the same guy I'd kicked out weeks ago, now floating on a giant inflatable flamingo. A cooler bobbed behind him like a companion dog. He waved at me mockingly, drink in hand. You again? I called out. He shrugged. Karen said I was good to go. She said you had to let people use it until the board figured it out. I took out my phone, not to call Karen but to call the sheriff. I wasn't bluffing this time. And when the officers arrived, I didn't rant. I didn't yell. I just calmly handed them the file I'd used at the HOA meeting, deed, surveys, zoning documents, attorney letter, and the meeting minutes showing Karen had acted outside of protocol. They read through it, nodded, then turned to the guy in the flamingo. You're trespassing, one of them said, voice flat. What? No man, Karen said. Karen's not the property owner, the deputy cut him off. And this lakefront is clearly marked private. You're on his dock. You're in violation. Step out of the water. You're joking, right? No, the officer said, already reaching for the handcuffs. I watched as the flamingo deflated on the dock while he was escorted, dripping and shivering, into the back of a cruiser. It wasn't violent. It wasn't dramatic. It was just beautiful, quiet, decisive justice. But the real cherry on top came the next day. The HOA board sent out an emergency notice. A mandatory meeting had been called for the following Thursday. The agenda? Clarification of HOA boundaries and review of president's conduct. Translation: Karen was officially under fire. When I walked into the meeting room that night, the energy had shifted. Gone were the nods of silent approval she once received when she walked in. No one rushed to her side. She sat stiffly at the head table, flanked by two visibly uncomfortable board members. There was no warm greeting, no opening speech. Just awkward silence. Until Marissa, one of the newer residents who'd once defended Karen, stood up and cleared her throat. I'd like to make a motion to remove Karen as board president, effective immediately. Boom. The room buzzed. Karen's eyes widened. She opened her mouth, probably to deliver one of her classic manipulative monologues, but it was too late. The motion was seconded, then thirded. The vote wasn't even close. She didn't speak. She just sat back, arms crossed, lips tight. No apology. No admission. Just that familiar simmering entitlement finally boiling dry. After she was removed, the new acting president, Brian, a quiet, level-headed guy who just wanted peace, stood and addressed the room. We've reviewed the property records, consulted with county officials, and spoken to legal counsel. Jamie's dock and lakefront are indisputably private. Going forward, the board will take no position on access to that space, and any future violations will be treated as individual trespassing matters. There it was. Final. Public. On record. I didn't cheer. I didn't smirk. I just nodded. Because I didn't need to gloat. The win spoke for itself. In the days that followed, things returned to a new kind of normal. My mailbox stayed empty, no more yellow notes. Neighbors I barely knew began waving again, even stopping by to say, "Hey, sorry about all that mess. Glad it got sorted." Karen? She kept her head down. Her dog walks shifted routes. Her cousin never returned, not even for the flamingo, which I later fished out and deflated myself. And me? I sat on the dock one evening, the lake calm, the sky a watercolor of orange and indigo, and finally, I breathed. Not just because I had one, but because I'd done it the right way. I hadn't stooped. I hadn't shouted. I'd out-researched, out-maneuvered, and outlasted. Karen had played her game, but I changed the rules. And that satisfaction? It didn't come with applause. It came with peace. It's been a few months since Karen was removed from the HOA board, and the neighborhood has never felt more normal. No drama, no petty notices, no self-appointed patrols scanning the lakeside for violations. People walk their dogs, wave again. Some even stop to chat at the mailbox instead of pretending they don't see me. It's not that we all became best friends overnight, but the tension? It lifted like fog burning off after a long storm. Karen still lives here, of course. I see her occasionally. She keeps her head down now, rarely makes eye contact, and avoids the lake altogether. The self-importance she used to wear like a crown has dulled into something smaller, quieter, maybe even uncertain. I'm not sure if she learned anything from all this, and honestly, that's not my problem. People like her don't change easily. They just learn where the limits are. And I made damn sure she found the limits. As for me, I've changed more than I expected. Before all this, I used to be the kind of person who avoided confrontation. I'd roll my eyes at HOA nonsense, mutter about it under my breath, maybe fire off an annoyed email if things got too ridiculous. But I never thought I'd be the one standing up at a packed board meeting, armed with zoning laws and legal exhibits, calmly dismantling a neighbor's power trip in front of 20 people. What I learned is this: you don't have to scream to win a battle. You just have to be willing to do the work, and be patient. Because sometimes the loudest person in the room isn't the strongest. Sometimes strength looks like restraint. It looks like knowing your rights, standing your ground, and letting the facts do the punching for you. There's also something deeply satisfying about justice that doesn't require revenge, only truth. The lake is peaceful again. No inflatable flamingos. No loud guests claiming they have every right to be there. Just the soft lap of water against my dock, the occasional heron swooping low, and the knowledge that I protected what was mine, not just the land but the principle. I still keep the file I made, the maps, the bylaw copies, even the photo of Karen's ridiculous laminated shared access sign. Not because I expect to use it again, but because it reminds me, Bullies don't always come in obvious packages. Sometimes they wear blazers and smile sweetly while they rewrite the rules behind your back. And when that happens, you can't rely on anyone else to stop them. You have to decide, quietly, calmly, that they picked the wrong person. That they underestimated you. And that they won't make that mistake again. Some neighbors told me later they were relieved someone finally stood up to her. That they'd been annoyed for years but afraid of becoming a target. I get that. HOAs are weird little microgovernments, and when one person grabs too much power, it can feel like there's no way to push back without becoming the villain in your own story. But I hope, in some small way, that what happened sent a message. That silence doesn't mean consent. That standing up for your boundaries doesn't make you difficult. And that sometimes the best way to deal with a bully is to let them run straight into the brick wall of truth. I still enjoy my mornings on the dock. Coffee in hand, feet dangling over the edge, water calm as glass. It feels different now, not just like peace but victory. A quiet, earned kind of peace. The kind that doesn't need witnesses. And every so often I'll hear a new neighbor ask, "Hey, wasn't there some drama with the lake last year?" And someone will laugh and say, "Yeah, but it got sorted out. Don't mess with Jamie's dock, that's sacred ground now." They're half joking, of course. But only half. Because sometimes defending your space isn't just about the place. It's about drawing a line so clear, so unshakable, that no one ever dares cross it again.